My beloved child. Do not let your hand move away from this moment just yet. Let the noise around you become quiet. Let the weight in your chest loosen, even if only for one breath, because what you are about to hear is not meant to frighten you or fill your heart with false certainty. It is a fictional whisper of hope, a sacred story for the part of you that has been wondering whether love can remember what silence tried to erase. Something has shifted in the unseen landscape of this story. Not loudly. Not with a dramatic confession, a sudden phone call, or a knock at your door. It happened in the stillness of an ordinary room, beneath the pale glow of a screen, when the person your heart has struggled to forget opened a conversation they had avoided for longer than they would ever admit. They were not searching for pain. They were not planning to revisit you. They told themselves they were only looking for something else: a date, a photograph, a forgotten address, some small detail buried beneath months of messages. But as their thumb moved through the past, their breathing changed. The room seemed to grow quieter. The present began to fade around them. And then they saw it. One old message from you. A message you may not even remember writing. A message that seemed simple when you sent it, because you did not know how deeply your words had entered them. You did not know that one day, after distance had rearranged everything, those words would return like light entering a locked room. They read the first line. Then they stopped. For a few seconds, they stared at your name above the message as though your name itself had become a doorway. Their finger hovered over the screen. Their chest tightened. A memory rose so suddenly that they could not prepare themselves for it. They remembered where they were when you sent it. They remembered the weather. They remembered the sound of your voice from that season of their life. They remembered the way you cared without demanding applause for it. And, my child, that was the moment the first tear appeared. Not because the message was cruel. Not because you had wounded them. They cried because your words were kind, and they finally understood the value of the kindness they once received too casually. There are moments when the heart recognizes something years after the mind dismissed it. There are truths that cannot enter while pride is standing guard. There are gifts that look ordinary until absence teaches the soul how rare they were. Your message became one of those truths. They read it again. Slower this time. Every word carried a different weight now. What once felt like a simple expression of care now sounded like evidence of a love they had not known how to hold. The spaces between your sentences seemed filled with all the things you had been too afraid to say. They could almost hear your voice. Not perfectly. Memory is never perfect. But it was close enough to break the distance they had built. In this fictional vision, the room around them was dim. The day had almost ended, and the last light rested against the wall like fading gold. Somewhere outside, a car passed. A door closed. Life continued with its ordinary rhythm. But inside them, time had stopped. They read your message once more. And this time, the tears did not remain silent. They covered their mouth, as though they could hide the sound from an empty room. Their shoulders trembled. They turned the phone face down, but the words had already moved beyond the screen. They were alive inside their memory now. Your message had reached the place they had been trying not to visit. The place where they still cared. The place where your name had never completely disappeared. The place where regret had been waiting without permission. You may have believed your words were forgotten. You may have imagined that your love passed through their life without leaving a mark. You may have looked at the silence between you and assumed it proved you meant nothing. But silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes silence is the place where unspoken feelings grow too large for a person who does not yet know how to face them. Sometimes distance is not created because love was weak, but because love revealed something the heart was not ready to become. And sometimes the person who walked away carries the memory of what they lost more heavily than the person who was left behind could ever see. They did not cry only because they missed you. That is only the beginning of this revelation. They cried because the message showed them a version of themselves they had forgotten. The person they were when you believed in them. The person they were when your presence made them feel seen. The person they might have become if fear had not convinced them to run from tenderness. Your old message did not merely remind them of you. It reminded them of who they were beside you. That realization moved through them like thunder beneath deep water. At first, they tried to resist it. They told themselves they were tired. They blamed the late hour. They said nostalgia was playing tricks on them. They reminded themselves of every reason the connection had become complicated. They replayed the misunderstandings, the delays, the moments when neither of you knew how to say what mattered. But your words remained. Gentle. Patient. Unchanged. Time had not made them bitter. Distance had not rewritten them. The message was still filled with the same warmth you placed inside it when you believed caring openly was safer than pretending not to care. And that sincerity unsettled them more than anger ever could. Anger would have been easier. Blame would have allowed them to defend themselves. A harsh message would have given them permission to close the conversation and feel justified. But your kindness gave them nowhere to hide. Your tenderness became a mirror. In that mirror, they saw the care they received, the care they failed to protect, and the loneliness that followed when they treated something precious as though it would always wait. My child, there is a particular kind of grief that arrives when a person realizes they were loved during a season when they did not know how to receive love. It is not the grief of having never been chosen. It is the grief of having been chosen and not understanding the blessing until the choosing became a memory. That grief reached them. Not all at once. It entered slowly, like rain darkening stone. First came the memory of your words. Then came the memory of your patience. Then came the memory of all the times you noticed the sadness they tried to disguise. They remembered how you asked if they were truly okay, not merely whether they were having a good day. They remembered the way you could sense a change in their voice. They remembered how you stayed gentle when they became distant. They remembered how you offered comfort without forcing them to explain every wound. And then another truth began to rise. A truth they had avoided because it demanded honesty. You did not leave their heart when the conversation stopped. You became quiet inside it. There is a difference. To leave is to disappear. To become quiet is to remain in a place where no one speaks your name, yet everything still echoes with your presence. Your memory had become quiet. But it had never become powerless. The old message awakened it. Suddenly, small details returned with astonishing clarity. A phrase you often used. The way you paused before saying something vulnerable. The warmth in your eyes when you tried to hide how deeply you cared. The night you stayed awake longer than you should have because they needed someone. The moment you encouraged them when they had lost confidence in themselves. The way you made ordinary conversations feel safe. They had forgotten the exact order of events, but they had not forgotten the feeling of being understood. And that feeling became the second reason they cried. They had been surrounded by people since you. They had laughed. They had gone places. They had answered messages. They had tried to move forward. From the outside, their life may have looked complete. But being surrounded is not the same as being known. Being desired is not the same as being understood. Being complimented is not the same as being seen. You had seen something in them that others only glanced at. You noticed the part of them that performed strength while secretly longing to rest. You recognized the fear behind their independence. You understood that their silence was often a request for patience, not an absence of feeling. They did not appreciate how rare that understanding was until they found themselves explaining their heart to people who listened only long enough to respond. Your message reminded them that once, they did not have to translate every feeling. You knew. Or at least, you tried to know. And the effort mattered more than they ever told you. They picked up the phone again. Their eyes were blurred now, but they opened the message anyway. There was a line near the end that seemed to glow brighter than the rest. Perhaps it was a promise. Perhaps it was reassurance. Perhaps it was something simple, like telling them they did not have to face everything alone. Whatever the words were, they struck a wound that had recently opened inside them. Because in the days before finding your message, they had felt alone. More alone than anyone around them realized. They had smiled through conversations. They had completed responsibilities. They had moved through their routine with practiced composure. But at night, when no one was watching, the questions returned. Who truly knows me? Who would remain if I stopped pretending to be strong? Who remembers the person beneath all these defenses? Then your old message appeared. It answered a question you did not know they were still asking. You once knew them. Maybe imperfectly. Maybe not completely. But sincerely. Your words were proof that someone had once looked beyond the surface and spoken directly to the hidden place inside them. That is why their tears deepened. They were not only mourning a relationship, a connection, or a missed opportunity. They were mourning the safety they felt with you. And safety is often the thing people miss long after they tell themselves they have moved on. In this fictional heavenly story, an unseen tenderness surrounded that room, not a supernatural command, not a promise of what must happen, but a symbol of grace meeting regret. Grace did not accuse them. Grace did not say, "You ruined everything." Grace simply invited them to see clearly. To remember without rewriting. To admit without escaping. To feel without immediately trying to fix the feeling. For the first time in a long while, they allowed themselves to sit with the truth. They missed you. Not just your attention. Not just the comfort of familiarity. They missed the way your presence brought softness into parts of them that had become hard. They missed who they were allowed to be when they trusted your heart. And there was something else. Something even they had not yet understood. The message was connected to a decision they had made recently. A decision involving their future. A decision they believed had nothing to do with you. But after reading your words, they began to question whether they had chosen that path from peace or from fear. This is where the story grows deeper. Because their tears were not only looking backward. Some of those tears were falling because the future suddenly looked different. They had spent so much time convincing themselves that the safest life was the one that required the least vulnerability. They had chosen predictability over honesty. They had accepted emotional distance as maturity. They had told themselves that needing no one was a sign of strength. But your message carried the memory of a different kind of courage. The courage to care. The courage to stay open. The courage to tell someone, "You matter to me," without knowing what answer would return. You had shown that courage once. Perhaps you paid a painful price for it. Perhaps you felt foolish afterward. Perhaps you wondered why you gave so much tenderness to someone who did not know how to respond. But now, in this story, they were finally seeing that your openness had never been weakness. It was bravery. And they were crying because they knew they had mistaken your strength for something they could postpone. They assumed your heart would remain nearby while they figured themselves out. They believed there would always be another conversation. Another chance to explain. Another evening when the distance could be repaired. But time does not always announce which moment will become the last familiar moment. One day, the conversation simply became quieter. Then less frequent. Then absent. Neither of you may have understood when the final thread broke. There was no ceremony. No sound of a door locking. Only the gradual realization that a person who once knew the rhythm of your days had become someone you could no longer reach without fear. They remembered that distance now. They remembered seeing your name and choosing not to respond immediately. They remembered composing messages and deleting them. They remembered telling themselves they would explain when they had more clarity. But clarity never arrived because avoidance does not create clarity. It only gives confusion more room to grow. Your old message exposed that. It showed them how certain your care had once been, and how uncertain their own response had made you feel. That realization became the third reason for their tears. They finally imagined the connection from your side. For so long, they had viewed the past through the lens of their own fear. They remembered feeling overwhelmed. They remembered not knowing what to say. They remembered needing space. But now they imagined you waiting. Checking your phone. Replaying conversations. Wondering whether you had said too much. Wondering whether your care had become a burden. Wondering why warmth was met with distance. They pictured the version of you who tried to stay hopeful while slowly realizing that hope alone could not carry two hearts. And, my child, regret entered them like a cold wind. Not because they believed you were perfect. Not because every misunderstanding belonged to them. But because they finally saw the pain their silence may have caused. Sometimes people believe they did nothing wrong because they never spoke cruelly. But silence can become cruel when it leaves another heart trapped inside questions. They understood that now. They realized that the absence of an answer can echo longer than the wrong answer. They realized that confusion can wound more deeply than rejection because confusion asks the heart to reopen the same door every day. And they wondered how many nights you carried questions they could have softened with honesty. They whispered something into the empty room. Your name. It sounded unfamiliar at first, because they had not allowed themselves to say it aloud in a long time. Then they said it again. Softer. As though your name were fragile. As though speaking it too loudly might disturb the memory. Their voice broke on the second attempt. They lowered their head and cried with the phone still glowing beside them. Yet beneath the sadness, another feeling began to appear. At first, it was so quiet they almost missed it. It was not happiness in the ordinary sense. It was not relief that everything would suddenly become easy. It was something more delicate. A strange warmth. A small, unexpected joy. The joy of realizing that the love they had received had been real. For months, perhaps longer, they had tried to reduce the connection to a mistake, a phase, or an emotional misunderstanding. They told themselves it could not have mattered that much. They minimized it because admitting its depth would have required admitting the loss. But your message refused to be minimized. It was too sincere. Too specific. Too alive with the person you were in that moment. As they read it, they knew. They had been loved. Not perfectly. Not without complications. But genuinely. And the recognition brought a painful joy. Because even when love does not become the story we hoped for, being truly cared for changes us. It leaves evidence. It teaches the heart what warmth feels like. It becomes a light by which future emptiness is recognized. They cried because they could finally feel the blessing inside the pain. You had given them something they did not know they were still carrying. A memory of being worth tenderness. A memory of being worth patience. A memory of someone believing there was goodness beneath their confusion. Your care had survived inside them, even while they tried to bury it. That was the hidden joy. And here is what they did not know. While they sat there reading, a change had already begun. Not a guaranteed reunion. Not a prophecy. Not a promise that they would return exactly as you once hoped. Something more honest. They began to become truthful with themselves. And truth is where every meaningful transformation starts. They opened the larger conversation. They scrolled upward. One message became 2. 2 became 5. Soon they were reading the story of your connection in fragments. Laughter. Concern. Late-night honesty. Small misunderstandings. Apologies. Encouragement. The quiet language two people build when they begin to recognize each other. They noticed how often you tried to lighten their burdens. They noticed the questions you asked when they withdrew. They noticed how many times you gave them room without making them feel abandoned. But they also noticed something about you. Something that made them sit upright. Your messages had changed before the distance became permanent. The warmth was still there, but it had become careful. Your sentences became shorter. Your honesty became guarded. You stopped asking certain questions. You stopped revealing how much you missed them. You began protecting yourself. At the time, they had interpreted that change as indifference. They believed you were losing interest. They told themselves your heart had moved on easily. But now, reading the messages in sequence, they saw what had really happened. You had not stopped caring. You had become tired of bleeding in a place where no one acknowledged the wound. The realization struck them so deeply that they set the phone down again. They could see the exact moment your hope began to close. It was not dramatic. You did not announce it. You did not punish them. You simply started giving less of yourself to the silence. And now they understood why. You were trying to survive the uncertainty. They remembered wondering why your energy had changed, yet never asking directly. They remembered missing the way you used to speak to them, while failing to recognize that their own inconsistency had taught you to become cautious. They wanted your softness without offering you safety. That truth hurt. But it also opened something. For the first time, their regret was not centered only on what they had lost. It was centered on what you had experienced. That is a deeper form of awakening. Immature regret says, I miss what you gave me. Maturing regret says, I am sorry for how my actions made you feel. They had not reached the end of that understanding. But they had taken the first step. They looked at the final message you had sent during that season. It was not the message that first made them cry. This was another one. A quieter message. A message that perhaps contained no accusation at all. Maybe you told them you hoped they were okay. Maybe you said you understood they were busy. Maybe you wished them peace. Perhaps you closed the conversation with more grace than they deserved. They read it now and recognized what they could not recognize then. It was a goodbye disguised as kindness. Not because you wanted to leave. Because you no longer knew how to stay without losing yourself. Their tears returned with greater force. They remembered reading it the first time and thinking there would be another message later. They did not know you had reached the edge of your strength. They did not know how many times you had rewritten those words. They did not know your hands may have trembled before you pressed send. They did not know you were offering peace while your own heart was breaking. Now they knew. Or at least, they imagined enough of the truth to feel its weight. And then something extraordinary happened inside this fictional story. They began writing a message to you. Not sending it. Not yet. Just writing. The first attempt was only 3 words. I am sorry. They stared at the sentence. It felt too small. They deleted it. They tried again. I found an old message from you tonight. They paused. Deleted that too. Every sentence seemed inadequate because language could not easily cross the distance created by months of silence. They wanted to explain everything at once. Their fear. Their confusion. Their regret. Their longing. Their realization. But they knew that explanations can sound like excuses when they arrive too late. So they placed the phone beside them and closed their eyes. In the silence, they asked themselves a question they had avoided for a very long time. What do I truly want? Not what looks safe. Not what protects pride. Not what others expect. Not what requires the least emotional risk. What does my heart actually want? Your face appeared in their memory. Not an idealized version. Not a perfect version. You as you were. Human. Complicated. Caring. Sometimes afraid. Sometimes tired. Still willing to show up with tenderness. They remembered a moment when you laughed so freely that they felt the sound inside their own chest. They remembered a time when you said something that made them feel capable again. They remembered how your presence could turn an ordinary hour into something they wanted to hold. And the answer to the question frightened them not with danger, but with honesty. They wanted to speak to you. They wanted to know who you had become. They wanted to know whether your heart still carried any space for truth. They wanted to hear your voice without pretending it would mean nothing. But desire alone was not enough. They understood that now. Wanting access to your heart did not mean they were entitled to it. Missing you did not erase what you endured. Crying over your message did not automatically make them ready to love you well. That realization mattered. Because genuine change does not begin with dramatic words. It begins when a person accepts responsibility for the version of themselves that caused harm. They could not return to you as the same person who left you confused. If they ever reached toward you, it would need to come from a place deeper than loneliness. It would need courage, consistency, humility, the willingness to hear your pain without becoming defensive. The willingness to accept that you may not respond as they hope. The willingness to care about your healing even if it does not lead them back into your life. For the first time, they considered these things. And something inside them grew quieter. The tears slowed. Their breathing softened. A strange peace entered the room. Not the peace of certainty. The peace of finally ceasing to lie to oneself. They picked up the phone once more. They returned to the original message. The one that had opened everything. They read the last line. That line contained the mystery they could not shake. Because your words seemed to describe something they were experiencing now. Perhaps you once told them that one day they would understand how deeply they were loved. Perhaps you wrote that even if distance came, you hoped they would remember they were never unworthy of care. Perhaps you told them that you believed they would find their way back to the truth inside themselves. Whatever you wrote, it felt as if the message had waited for this exact version of them to read it. Not because the message predicted the future. Because wisdom sometimes needs time before the heart can receive it. Your words had been early. Their understanding had been late. But the meaning had survived. They began to cry again, though now the tears were different. These tears carried gratitude. They were grateful you had existed in their life. Grateful that someone had once cared enough to speak hope over them. Grateful that your love had not been a fantasy created by memory. The evidence was there on the screen. Your words were real. Your effort was real. Your patience was real. And although this realization hurt, it also gave them something they had not felt in a long time. The desire to become better. Not to perform change so they could win you back. Not to make one grand gesture and expect the past to disappear. They wanted to become capable of honoring the kind of love they had once mishandled. That is where the unexpected joy entered fully. Your old message did not only make them mourn. It awakened hope in them. Hope that they were not trapped forever inside their old patterns. Hope that regret could become a teacher instead of a prison. Hope that they could learn to speak before silence harmed someone again. Hope that they could stop running when tenderness made them feel exposed. Hope that the love you offered had planted something good, even if it took a long season to grow. And, my child, you unknowingly became part of that transformation. You may have thought the message disappeared into a forgotten conversation. You may have regretted sending it. You may have felt embarrassed for being so open. You may have wished you could take back every word that revealed how deeply you cared. But in this fictional story, those words became a seed. For a long time, the seed remained beneath the surface. Nothing appeared to happen. There was no sign. No visible growth. No evidence that your tenderness had mattered. Yet beneath the silence, the memory remained. Then, on an ordinary evening, the seed broke open. Your message reached them again. Not as something new, but as something finally understood. This is why you must never measure the value of your love only by the response it received at the time. Sometimes people are not emotionally awake enough to recognize the gift in front of them. That does not mean the gift was worthless. It means their understanding had not yet caught up with your sincerity. Still, my child, hear this gently. Their awakening does not require you to reopen every door. Their tears do not create an obligation for you. Their regret does not erase your healing. This story is not asking you to wait in pain or place your life on hold for someone who has not shown change through action. Your worth is not proven by whether they return. Your love was real because of the truth within you, not because of what they eventually decide to do. There is power in knowing you mattered without making their response the center of your future. You are allowed to continue. You are allowed to heal. You are allowed to become someone who no longer begs for clarity from people who choose confusion. You are allowed to love the memory and still protect the present. You are allowed to wish them peace while choosing peace for yourself. Perhaps the deepest purpose of this fictional revelation is not to tell you what they will do. Perhaps it is to remind you that your kindness was never wasted. You became part of another person's awakening, even if you never witnessed the moment. Your words carried light farther than you knew. But the light was not meant only for them. Some of it has returned for you. Because while they were reading your old message, you were living through your own transformation. You were learning how to stand after disappointment. You were learning that love without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. You were learning to stop measuring your beauty through another person's ability to recognize it. You were learning to give yourself the reassurance you once waited to receive. You were becoming more honest about what you need. More careful with who receives your tenderness. More willing to walk away from uncertainty that repeatedly wounds you. You may not feel stronger every day. Healing rarely announces itself with triumph. Sometimes healing looks like checking their page less often. Sometimes it looks like going an entire afternoon without replaying the final conversation. Sometimes it looks like hearing their name and still being able to breathe. Sometimes it looks like admitting you miss them without turning that feeling into a command to return. You have changed, and somewhere inside the story, they sensed that before they ever opened the message. They had felt your absence differently lately. Not because you vanished completely, but because the emotional thread they once assumed would always remain available had begun to loosen. They could no longer feel the same silent waiting from you. Your energy symbolically, emotionally had turned toward your own life. That shift unsettled them. They did not understand why until tonight. Now they did. You were no longer standing in the same place. The message they were reading came from a version of you who was still reaching toward them. But the person you are becoming has begun reaching toward peace. That contrast deepened their urgency. They realized they could not assume you were still waiting at the door they once refused to open. They realized you may have discovered happiness in places that did not require you to question your value. They realized someone else might one day receive the love they once treated casually. And yet, this was not jealousy in its smallest form. It was grief mixed with admiration. They saw that you had always possessed the courage to love deeply. Now they feared that courage would belong to a future they were no longer part of. They opened the message field again. This time they did not write an apology first. They wrote your name. Then they sat with it. A long time passed. The room grew darker. The screen dimmed and brightened as they touched it again. They wrote one sentence. A truthful sentence. Then another. They did not try to sound impressive. They did not hide behind humor. They did not pretend the old message had only made them nostalgic. They began telling the truth. They wrote that they had found your words. They wrote that they had read them more than once. They wrote that they finally understood something they should have understood long ago. They admitted they had not known how to receive the care you gave. They admitted that their silence had not meant you were insignificant. It had meant they were afraid of what your presence awakened. They wrote that they were sorry. Not as a key to unlock your heart. As an acknowledgement that your heart had deserved better. Then their finger moved toward the send button. And stopped. Because one final question rose inside them. Would sending the message bring you peace, or would it reopen a wound they had no right to disturb? That question changed everything. They realized contacting you could not be only about relieving their regret. They could not place the weight of their awakening into your hands and expect you to carry it. They needed to know whether they were ready to remain honest after the emotion of the night faded. Would they still mean these words tomorrow? Would they have the courage to respond if you expressed hurt? Would they stay present if the conversation became uncomfortable? Would they respect your silence if you chose not to answer? Would they prove growth through consistency, or disappear again after one vulnerable moment? They did not know. And because they did not know, they did something different from what their old self would have done. They waited. Not from avoidance. From responsibility. They saved the message without sending it. Then they opened a blank page and began writing everything they needed to confront within themselves. The patterns. The fear. The excuses. The moments they ran from closeness. The reasons your love felt both comforting and terrifying. The truth was not simple. Your presence had made them feel safe, but safety itself had frightened them. Because when someone feels safe, the walls begin to fall. And when walls fall, old wounds become visible. They had spent years believing control would protect them. Then you appeared with patience, and suddenly control was no longer enough. You invited them into a kind of closeness that required honesty. They wanted it. They feared it. They moved toward you. Then pulled away. They missed you when you gave them space. Then became overwhelmed when you came close. You may have blamed yourself for this confusion. You may have changed your words, your appearance, your timing, or your needs, trying to become easier for them to choose. But their inconsistency was never proof that you were difficult to love. It was evidence of a conflict within them. They desired connection, yet feared dependence. They desired understanding, yet feared exposure. They desired your warmth, yet feared what losing it would do to them. So they created the loss before the loss could surprise them. That pattern had not begun with you. You simply came close enough to reveal it. And now, through one old message, they finally saw the pattern clearly. This was the greatest revelation of the night so far. They had spent months telling themselves the connection failed because the timing was wrong. But timing was not the whole truth. Fear had shaped the timing. Avoidance had shaped the silence. Unhealed wounds had shaped the distance. And unless those things were faced, even the most beautiful reunion would eventually repeat the same pain. They understood this. The realization did not destroy their hope. It purified it. They no longer wanted a dramatic return built only on emotion. They wanted the kind of transformation that could hold what their heart had once dropped. So they made a quiet promise to themselves. Before asking for another chance with you, they would become honest enough to deserve a conversation. Before speaking about love, they would learn how to remain present when love became vulnerable. Before asking you to trust them, they would begin building trust within their own actions. The old message had become a turning point. But there was still something hidden inside it. Something they had not noticed during the first reading. A detail buried in the timestamp. They looked at the date. Their breath caught. The message had been sent on a day that connected to something happening in their life now. A date they had been thinking about. A date linked to a choice, a memory, or an anniversary they had tried to ignore. The coincidence felt emotionally overwhelming, not as proof of fate, but as a symbol too meaningful to dismiss. They stared at the date and remembered what had happened that day. They remembered what you did not know. They remembered the private struggle they had been carrying when your message arrived. You had reached them during one of the loneliest moments of their life, though they never told you. At the time, they responded casually. Perhaps with a short reply. Perhaps with a heart symbol. Perhaps not at all. But your message had found them on a night when they had questioned whether anyone would notice if they disappeared emotionally from the world. Your words interrupted that darkness. You did not know. They never told you. And now, all this time later, they understood that your message had helped them more than they ever admitted. That was the secret behind their tears. Not only regret. Not only longing. Not only the realization that they had been loved. Your words had once kept hope alive in them during a moment you knew nothing about. They remembered sitting alone that night. They remembered feeling invisible. They remembered reading your message and taking one deeper breath. They remembered thinking, maybe I matter to someone. Then life continued, and they buried the memory beneath everything that followed. Until now. Now the full meaning returned. They cried because you had unknowingly reached them when they needed it most. You believed you were sending an ordinary message. But to them, it had been a lifeline. They never thanked you. They never told you. They may have even made you feel foolish for caring. Yet your care had touched a hidden place inside them and helped them survive an emotional night they did not know how to explain. That realization changed the message they had saved. They opened the draft again. They added one final line. A line they had never spoken to anyone. A line containing the truth about that night. Their finger hovered over the screen again. And this time, they were closer to sending it. But before they could decide, another message appeared on their phone. A message from someone connected to the choice they had recently made about their future. They read it. Their face changed. The warmth in the room disappeared beneath a sudden stillness. Because the new message demanded an answer before morning. It concerned a commitment they had been preparing to accept. A path that would move them farther away from you not only physically, but emotionally. Until tonight, they had believed that path was settled. Now your old words had reopened everything. They looked from the new message to the unsent one addressed to you. Two futures glowed in their hands. One was safe, predictable, and approved by everyone around them. The other was uncertain, vulnerable, and filled with truth they had delayed for far too long. Their tears stopped. Their breathing became steady. For the first time, they understood that reading your message had not been the final event of the night. It had been the beginning. Because before sunrise, they would have to choose whether to continue the life built around avoiding their heart or finally confess the secret they had hidden since the very day you sent those unforgettable words. And, my child, the sentence they were about to send you was not merely an apology. It contained a truth about your last conversation that you never knew. A truth capable of changing the meaning of the silence between you. Their finger moved toward the screen. The room held its breath. And just before they pressed send, they whispered, they deserve to know what really happened.